Hello everyone, good evening. My name is Pooja Pandey, and on behalf of the Education and Maharashtra teams of Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, I welcome all of you to this virtual panel discussion on Passing the Baton, Implications of Public-Private Partnerships in Education for the Rights of the Child. The objective for today's discussion is to take a deep dive into the intricacies of public-private partnerships in education, particularly in early childhood education, and converse about its possible implications on equity as well as accountability. We are very, very delighted to have a wonderful set of panelists as well as a moderator joining us today. And I'd like to take a very brief moment to introduce all of them. The moderator for today's discussion is Professor Ankar Sareen, who is an assistant professor in the Public Systems Group at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. We are also joined by two other eminent panelists. We have with us Mr. Saurabh Taneja, the CEO at the Akanksha Foundation, and we also have Mr. Madhukar Banuri, who's the founder and CEO at Leadership for Equity, or LFE. On behalf of Vidhi, a very welcome to all of you. Let me also take a very brief moment to walk you through the format for today's discussion. So right after the introduction, my colleague Sakshi and I will start the event by sharing some of the key findings from our recent study on public-private partnerships in education, which has laid the foundation for today's discussion. And after that, we'll hand it over to Professor Sareen, who will thereon take the panel discussion forward. Question and answer will be taken towards the end of the session, and we highly encourage all the participants to type in their question in the chat box and actively engage with the research team as well as with this stellar set of panelists that we have. I'd also like to welcome Stuti and Gargi, who will be assisting us with sign language interpretation throughout this event. If at any point you face any technical glitch, feel free to reach out to any of us. And we'll also be live streaming this on Facebook. We are doing that currently. Once again, I welcome all of you to this discussion, and without any further delay, let's get into the subject matter right away. As I was mentioning before as well, the topic of this panel discussion finds its genesis in a recent study that Vidhi has conducted on understanding the application of a public-private partnership model in education. Now, this is sort of a commonplace knowledge that there is an increasing interest in resorting to public-private partnerships for the delivery of social services, and education definitely is no exception there. However, the evidence and opinions around the efficacy of PPP models in education are mixed in India. There are two sides to it. On one hand, we have the proponents who claim PPPs as being high quality and more effective in the utilization of resources as compared to their government counterparts. On the other hand, we have opponents who generally argue that PPPs shift the responsibility from the state providers to private players to deliver education, and this is in contravention to the state's obligation to provide education as a matter of right. It often also raises questions on equitable access to schooling through increased privatization and commercialization of education in India. Interestingly, across India, there is no legislative framework, either centrally or within states, which guide PPPs in education. And in order to understand this further, we at Vidhi conducted this study, and we took the case of urban Maharashtra to comprehend this entire governance of PPPs in education. Now, the study that we conducted was contextualized to the early stages of education or early childhood education. It's also known as ECE generally. And on a side note, it's also equally important to understand why is ECE important and what does the landscape of ECE in India looks like. So to present that, I'd like to play a very small video, which will broadly highlight the landscape of ECE in India and will also feature the objectives of the study. And right after the video, my colleague Sakshi will take it on from there. I'm requesting Maitreyi to kindly play the video now. Thank you.
A child's life is at its most vulnerable yet receptive from 0 to 6 years of age. Care and education in these early years lay down the foundation of the child's cognitive, emotional, and physical well-being. In recognition of this, the National Early Childhood Care and Education, or ECCE Policy 2013, provides guidelines for childcare and educational practices, cross-referencing related policies for the provisioning of nutrition, health and hygiene, protection, and care. Together, this ensures holistic ECCE. The National Education Policy 2020 further emphasizes the importance of early childhood education, or ECE, in setting goals of universalizing ECE in India by 2030. Despite recommendations of various committees and experts, as of now, ECE is not recognized as a right within any legislation in India. While the primary provider of early childhood care and education is the Anganwadi system, various ECE centers have cropped up across the country, run as public schools, government-aided schools, and government-unaided schools. Many choose to attend these in lieu of Anganwadis with the hope of receiving higher quality ECE. On closer look, however, the existing policy framework fails to set uniform standards for provisioning of ECE for this larger ecosystem of providers. Vidhi's report, Passing the Baton, deep dives into a public-private partnership model for providing ECE run by the Municipal Corporation of Greater Mumbai. Under this model, over 20 NGOs are provided aid by the MCGM and tasked with delivering ECE in centres called Balwadis. We find that without a suitable policy governing the model, access to Balwadis and quality of care and education provided to students in such centres is not equitable. For example, it is not clearly defined what entitlements or support services the MCGM is required to provide to their students. Thus, some NGOs on their own volition provide midday meals while others cannot. Disadvantaged groups such as children with disabilities face possible incidences of exclusion under the model, as Balwadi teachers are not trained to identify or teach students with disabilities. Balwadis are also free to choose their own curriculum and do not adhere to any pupil-teacher ratio, with as many as 35 to 40 children enrolled in a single classroom in some instances. In other words, care and education received by students is determined by the particular NGO running a Balwadi rather than being standardized by the state. To know more about this model and about the need for greater regulation of non-state providers of ECE, check out Vidhi's recently launched report, Passing the Baton, Understanding the PPP Model of Pre-Primary Education in Mumbai.
Thank you, Pooja and Maitri. I hope you all enjoyed the video. As was shown in the video, we had conducted a study on PPPs in ECE using the example of the Balwadis in the MCGM area. But without going into a deep dive on the findings of the study, I will talk about the broad issues that we actually saw in the study. The first one is regarding the principles of equity. Most provisions of the RTE Act, which is the major act governing right-based education in India, does not actually apply to pre-primary education. This means that there is a lack of a benchmark of standards that PPPs and ECE can actually adhere to. This leads to a lack of certain provisions, such as parent-teacher ratio, student-teacher ratio, minimum qualifications of teachers, and also other norms and standards vary from model to model due to this lack of benchmark. We also see that due to this lack of provisions provided in the RTE Act applying to pre-primary education, there are greater chances of exclusion for certain marginalized and disadvantaged categories of students, including girl children as well as children with disabilities. The second point that we notice is a lack of accountability that may be there in these models. When we speak of accountability, we mean that generally there should be less administrative hassles, there should be no corruption, and there should be consistent checks and balances placed on both parties throughout the continuity of the PPP. Keeping this in mind, there are 3 points that we have to look at. The first one is monitoring. There should be consistent monitoring that is done using specific standards of the private party in the organization. Alongside that, there should also be accountability placed on both the parties, that is the government as well as the private party in the PPP. Second point is the voice of stakeholders. there is a need for proper inclusion of the voices of parents and teachers. This can be done by providing parent-teacher associations, making space for teachers' unions, and also providing well-designed grievance redressal mechanisms in the PPP itself. The third point that we can see is that there needs to be a clear entry and exit mechanism, which is competitive, transparent, and fair for the parties. There needs to be a set of standards as to how a private party can apply for these PPPs, what are the proper grounds for the acceptance and rejection of these parties, as well as the state must reserve the rights to suspend contracts with partners on grounds of non-compliance or poor performance, which are clearly provided within the PPP itself. All of these points can be provided as long as there is a clear and robust policy framework in place for PPPs in ECE. States need to approach new partnerships in education with better preparedness, and they must also ensure that the existing partnerships that they have in ECE are appropriately regulated and are inclusive. Now I will pass on this discussion to the esteemed panel, who will take it from here and enlighten us with points that they have to provide. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you, Sakshi. And let me just begin by complimenting your entire team, Avinash, Nisha, Pooja, Dr. Rahela, and you, Sakshi. I think you all have done an excellent job with this report. I love the fact that you've taken a deep dive in one area and one geography, one specific geography, because that allows sort of the emergence of details which we otherwise don't get to see and hear about. So I think on that account, it's truly a report that I think would make a significant contribution in this discussion around public-private partnerships. And I have two sort of panelists here who I think represent in some sense different sides of public-private partnerships. So I'm happy to sort of make sure that they do more of the speaking, and I'll just do the gentle nudging and questioning from time to time. The question that I really want to perhaps begin, and I'll of course invite your thoughts in general on the report and what you might have found particularly interesting and what might resonate with you. But the question that I wanted to begin with both Saurabh and Madhukar really was, do you like this term PPP? I mean, public-private partnership. I mean, and in particularly, do you like this, big umbrella that we've created called private, which includes so many different distinct actors? And should we perhaps start making a distinction there? And perhaps, making distinctions there would help us, at least to some extent, begin to address some of the issues that the report is raising. So, it's I know it's a broad question, but so if maybe Saurabh, maybe if we could begin with you in terms of sort of your thoughts, your reactions, and maybe this question that I put in front. Go ahead, Saurabh.
Thank you, Professor Sareen, for that thought-provoking question. Come to think of it, I hadn't really sort of ever thought about the connotations or deeper embedded nuances in the phrase public-private partnership. I see now, though, how sometimes, when we try to attach this umbrella term of private, how the genuine ideologically aligned non-state actors or non-profits like us can sort of be perceived, in the same light where we start thinking about privatization. And as Akanksha, we've sometimes had to sort of feel that kind of a perception, despite, having a rich history of almost 30 years of, being at the forefront of this service delivery. So it is a thought-provoking stance. And the only question going through my mind is, I don't know what is the potential alternative phrase that we should use. I do like the term partnership. I do think that, if a lot of the focus was on unpacking and figuring out the division of responsibility, which is what I picked up from the report as well, that how there are gaps in just defining the clear division of responsibility on partnerships front. That, in my view, is a huge lacuna and something that can be addressed. But I'll pause here and let Madhukar also sort of chime in, given his, recent experiences.
Thanks, Saurabh, and thanks, Professor Sareen. Firstly, I think it's congratulations to Vidhi and the entire team for putting out this report. I think got a chance to sort of skim through and also read the synopsis. Pretty good. A lot of very balanced approach, I should say. I think rather than promoting one or saying the other, I think it was a very balanced approach of your findings. So congratulations on that. I mean, the PPP, I mean, the word it is used, given that we work very closely within the governments now at the organizations, I think more than positive, I think it's a negative connotation, quite honestly. I think the way people inside the systems perceive PPP is always as a threat. Because historically, there's always this piece about privatization, and then how government institutions and departments are being privatized. So the minute you have a private, even though partners, Saurabh was saying, partnership is a more powerful word there than the private word, right? So I think it is still seen as a threat, which I think is also troubling. End of the day, all of us are private partners who are supporting the government to deliver whatever they're supposed to in terms of services in a more effective way. Let it be if you're directly working with children or schools, or even working with the government on policy level, there's some level of partnership that's always there. I think more than terminologies, I don't know what is the best word to actually replace this. I think the focus, the more and more I think we are working with the government, it is clear that the intent has to be clear. In terms, and it has to be clarified with the government. So it does, end of the day, some might call it PPP, some might call it non-state actors, non-state partnership, whatever you call it. What is the end intent? What is the intention with which you want to work with governments? What are the end intentions where you want to improve the delivery to a common man is something that we need to be very consciously communicating. And if that intent is clear, it doesn't matter you call that partnership a PPP or a non-state actor, but I think the why behind that partnership has to be at the forefront rather than the terminologies. Because right now also, even in Maharashtra, there are multiple sort of organizations which are working within the government, and sometimes you realize, oh, like this is a great example of a public-private partnership, but then they don't call it, like they call it something else, right? And the government perceives it also very differently. Maybe there is less threat around that partnerships. Maybe there is better communication, maybe there's a high political and administrative buy-in, but I think the intent has to be clear. In fact, one of the findings that the report has passed is the first one. I think I was reading the summary in which the clarity of these partnership has to be out there, and I think that's where I would focus on rather than the term in itself.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't want to get into a debate on the semiotics and semantics of the phrase, but the what I was trying to, in some ways, and I think I hear that from you all also, is that often so when you look at this report and the organizations that have been studied, these are 20 NGOs, right? And linking it back to the question of intent, right? The intent presumably of an NGO is very different from a commercial entity, and how partnerships play out, I imagine, are going to be very different when you have an entity with different objectives, different motivations sitting on the other side. And unfortunately, what at least the impression I get is oftentimes on the backs of sort of very committed work that is being done by organizations who are who have no other objective other than education, come a whole lot of other interests. And I think that's, so if there is a way, and I know, this will always be a struggle in terms of vocabulary, but if there is a way, perhaps that might help ease some of the tensions that arise. And as you say, Madhukar, I mean, there's almost nothing that is delivered without partnerships and without there being some private entity. I mean, at one level, all individuals, teachers themselves are private entities as well. So, yeah, and this, on the question of also, when Pooja began the discussion, she was mentioning how there's sort of, there's evidence on both sides as far as PPPs. So let's just stick to that term for the time being. So where do you think these partnerships, with public authorities, etc., And in what arenas do you, in your experience, have they worked better? Even either for you as an organization, because I'm sure you've seen multiple ways in these, ways in which partnerships happen, or even from what you've seen with other organizations. So maybe I'll go with Madhukar first this time.
So many professors are, I think there are multiple partnerships that exist. Different governments again operate very differently. Broadly, the way I'm categorizing, again, I'm looking from this end in terms of how PPPs are perceived. There's one level, broadly, if you had to categorize them, right? Like there's one set of organizations which are working on improving policy, right? Like right from your setting up these PMU units, and even there are non-state actors, non-profit organizations, non-state actors who are actually working on it, running your FLN missions, like running like multiple large-scale sort of education programs, helping the government sort of roll out, building the capacity and the muscle to be able to sort of draft policies which are rooted in children and teachers. So a lot of work is happening, and I think over the last 5-6 years has been a incremental sort of push to be able to have these PMU kind of organizations which are supporting with policy formulation, right? So that's one big bucket. So I'm clubbing a bunch of organizations around program management, helping draft policies and roll them out. That's one big bucket. Second big bucket is the whole people piece of it, right? Like think of all the stakeholders within any sort of delivery mechanism of education, right? From your, let it be Anganwadis, Balwadis, or even K-12 education. The elements of working with, say, teachers, or middle management officers, school leaders, SCRTs, diets, a bunch of even ECCA supervisors, CDPOs. There's a huge set, and that's where I think majority of the organizations, 80 to 90% of the organizations are focused on building capacity and able to do that. And in some ways also sort of delivering the the last mile service themselves, right? In terms of that, like, Akanksha is a great example. Many other PPP school models were able to do that. And the third piece of it is just the process, because apart from these two, policy and people, there are organizations who are just trying to streamline and showcasing it, like more of building something, showcasing certain aspect, like it can be in terms of delivering a high sort of quality literacy numeracy program or a nutrition program that you're doing. You pilot it in a couple of schools, say that this is a process that need to be sort of followed, and then push the government and advocate for it to be adopted, right? I mean, Asha workers is a great example, but Dr. Bang and family sort of tried to do that, and now it's like one of the best programs in India. So I think so broadly, the way I'm categorizing it is these three. There might be fourth also, but I think the way I'm seeing 99% of the organization fit into these three buckets. And I think many partnerships are able to drive their agenda or the agenda of what that intent needs to be around these three pieces. There was other point I wanted to add around equity piece of it, but it just broadly piece around like the kind of partnerships are centered around these three pieces.
Saurav, and if you could also share how Akanksha has engaged, and where do you think things sort of work out a little bit better?
Yeah, happy to, Professor Sareen. So Akanksha's engagement has primarily been to one of the clauses that even Vidhi's policy document alludes to, which is in MCGM called as full school management with private teachers. And so our Akanksha's experiences, I have to admit, limited to MMR, Mumbai metropolitan region, and Pune metropolitan region, and more lately in Nagpur. So I have to admit, Professor Sareen, that the benchmarks of success are unfortunately been defined by organization internally. If you were to really sit down with the government officials and sit with them and say, like, look, how will you evaluate this partnership now that it's been over 13, 14 years? There's no joint criteria that really objectively determines whether this partnership, so to speak, has been successful or not. We had set out certain objectives in how we wanted to operate our model, in this policy, in terms of learning outcomes, in terms of how much we wanted to spend, how did we want to deliver against the division of responsibility. So I have that internal analysis, and I believe we have done better. And that's why government is keen for Akanksha to run more schools, and other city governments are keen for Akanksha to come in and run more schools. So I see that pull factor. However, has there been an objective evaluation of, what have we done well, what have we not done well? it's something that's not been defined, not just with Akanksha, but for the entire PPP, which is today run with 7 other nonprofits in Mumbai, right? And it's the same in Pune. What we have begun to see, though, Professor Sareen, is through our experience, we have begun to take the onus of building some of this as a part of our framework of partnership upfront. So I wanted to give an example that in the last 4 years, Akanksha has set up 7 new schools with 2 new municipal corporations, one with Navi Mumbai and one with Nagpur. And when you see the design of the MOU, which Vidhi also alluded to, is that in there is a shared ownership to have third-party evaluations after a certain period of time to really see collectively, are we really making a difference, right? And we really appreciate that intent coming in upfront, but it's sort of taken a decade-long experience to, be proactive in communicating that let's just have this in, because today it's Akanksha running this and you trust our intention. Tomorrow it may be someone else. So, as a clause, it's important to sort of include it as a part of your design of the policy framework or the MOU that you build in. So sorry if I'm not answering your question directly, but I just wanted to share that when you ask me this, I have my analysis and we are getting the pull. So we might sort of beat our chest and say, yes, we've been successful. Honestly, today, I don't know, the one who sort of conceptualized the policy, will they see this as success or not?
So just if I can stay with you on that sort of, Akanksha and organizations like Akanksha, Muktangan, in some ways they are always, idolized and, for good reason. I'm just, again, going back to this question of motivations, intent and all that also, what would be your ideal scale size? How big can you imagine Akanksha to be? How many schools, would you, or cities, do you think Akanksha would be able to sort of, handle and do what it really cares about? This is more an organizational question, but I'm just again trying to get a sense of capacity here in terms of, responses from actors. So yes, sir.
So we've also had multiple debates on this, Professor Sareen, and we sort of keep swinging back about how much should an organization scale vis-a-vis sort of figure out scaling its mission. If you were to ask me today that what is it that we intend to do, that in a city with about 100 to 120 schools, we look at, say 5 to 8% of the total schools, can those be run and directly managed by Akanksha? And look, this is coming from some of the learnings from academies and charter schools in US, as well as now, the PPP model has been tried in Africa, Liberia, and a couple of other countries as well. And we've been seeing, what is the percentage of schools that they sort of look at. So we've been looking at in general, like in a particular city, 5 to 8%, but not beyond that in any capacity. And in terms of the number of cities, Professor Sareen, is a hard one to answer. We've had aspirations to grow to 10, but in lack of any framework like that you all mentioned at the beginning, it's really hard to then convince the government officials to sort of show them the merit in this particular model. What does it really do for the city? How can it really support the government ecosystems, schools, if at all it does? So it's been hard. Like, our aspirations have been to sort of grow to 10 cities over the next 10, 15 years. But like, those aspirations have not turned into reality. And one of the biggest bottlenecks have been, lack of favorable policies. And it spends a lot of the time and energy, in convincing someone to do that. So it took us nearly 4 years to sort of grow to a third city or the fourth municipal corporation, in absence of a structured statewide policy or a nationwide policy for such programs, Professor Sareen.
Madhukar, since your organization in particular does a whole lot of work, and I think the objective is to, improve system capacity and sort of talk about scale through the public system. And you mentioned that many folk within the government still see this idea of PPP as a threat. But in terms of So one is the issue of acceptance, and how does one tackle that challenge in some ways. And Saurabh is saying that, look, if I have to enter a new city, the work that requires, right? I mean, the transaction cost, the barriers that seem to be fairly high. So how does one come to at least a more efficient way to allocate these costs? The other is, what do you see within government departments in terms of capacity to handle, monitor, regulate PPPs? And are these capacities very different from what they would otherwise have to do if they were just running schools within the government hierarchy or the government authority?
I think so. I think to the second question around the capacity, the leadership to have the ability to get together a group of nonprofits which are rooted in, what is the vision for the city. Like even in MCGM you take, I think they start more operationally, which is very easy for the government officials, right? And we work with a number of them. It always comes down to like action saying ki kya karna hai, इस पे करना है, usko लेके आना hai, rather than saying ki boss, this is what MCGM as a city needs. These were the number of kids, this is what it needs. And then to make this vision possible, here are certain things that we're going to do. Here are the partners that we're going to get. Those are the kind of conversations you'd want to have. But the ability to be able to do that is extremely restricted. Like in a few, and of course, I'm not going to say zero at all, but in a state like Maharashtra, Lafri, you have about 150 to 200 class 1 officers. Now, these are the administrative heads of all the districts, like district education officers and like your MCGM's administrative head for education. All of these specific roles are filled by these 150 to 200 people. Now, these guys govern the entire administrative structure of the state of Maharashtra, which is roughly about 1.1 lakh schools. Now, for out of these 150, maximum 10% of them have that ability to do that. Now, I think, can we sort of build the capacity for the remaining 90%, or if not 50 to 60% of them to be able to have these conversations? So it's extremely limited. In fact, one of the things that we do at LFE is also, whenever we directly work with the district administrations, we work with about 5 or 6 districts. And one of the first things that we do is we help them set up an NGO CSR cell, because whoever are the NGOs and CSRs coming in, if I submit we are now talking about policy, but a simple thing also, getting a permission to do some pilot or to do an intervention, it takes anywhere between like a good month, 2 months to resolve and get permission. Now, can you bring that down to like a good 3 to 5 days? In 5 days, can you just tell the nonprofit like, हाँ कि ना? Like, इसमें कोई बड़ी बात नहीं है. So how do you sort of do that and put like those structures in place to be able to build the capacity is where sort of the work needs to happen. But to answer your question, it's very limited right now. I think a lot more effort needs to go in that direction. Otherwise, you'll see an NGO as an opportunity to sort of get their work done, as an opportunity to say कि कोई CSR funding आ रहा है तो चलो ठीक है आप इसमें लगा लो. So it's very, very sort of skewed in terms of the understanding. So I feel like that needs to change, and I think that's where a lot of our efforts are. I think the first question I'd like to answer from some of the beliefs, right? I think just around PPP and some of the beliefs, it's always on a spectrum. There are obviously far left organizations who say, these are important, you need to demonstrate proof point, you need to be able to allow a lot of privatization. The far right organizations were like, no, from a socialist equity angle, this is how it needs to be. We as an organization are slightly more center right that way. So I think a lot of my answers and beliefs are also aligned in that direction. But I think one is a couple of beliefs, right? I think one is just the problem of education in India is not a problem of one child, 100 child, or even a lakh children, right? It's a problem of 1 million children. And if the issue of a single organization, a few organizations trying to run schools was true, that wouldn't have served the purpose. It can serve a purpose. If the problem of India really was 10,000 children not getting quality education, I would say, great, let's just run high-performing 100 schools and get it done with, right? That's not the issue. The second piece of it is this issue of equity. Even in India right now, I mean, there was a lot of good, interesting, in fact, insights in the report that I was reading, that you guys in the current report that we're discussing. Around this issue of equity, the principles of equity, it holds true for even non-profit organizations. If you look at the state of Maharashtra, Pune is the largest district that gets the CSR funds across India, right? There are so many funds in the Paschim Maharashtra, which is your Bombay, Pune, We work in the Vidarbha side area, you can hardly pick and choose. You can look NGOs hai, unko pata bhi nahi hai kya NGOs hai wahan pe. So there's equity right there. So even in the tribal department, how many of the NGOs are actually working in the tribal schools, getting the PPP models in tribal? Many of these are concentrated towards cities, right? So it also plays out in a zoomed out when you start zooming out of Bombay and looking at Maharashtra. There's that equity angle also that plays into picture. So the belief to say that non-profit organizations that truly sort of attacking on the equity thing, it needs to be sort of slightly more adjustable to align to the demographics of a state or a nation. That's the second one. The third piece of it is there's the ability of NGOs to be able to do this work, because right now I think for a network about 50 schools, 100 schools, like even like an Akanksha network, right? Like 30, 40 schools, sort of, if I'm not wrong, the network that is, it runs great, but I think after beyond a point, what it just starts breaking down, right? Because if any organization had to run 1,000 school network, and to answer even some of the points that Saurabh was making, it's going to, the ability of nonprofits is limited. Even the largest private school network in Asia, which is funded by the government, is Rayat Shikshan Sanstha. They run roughly about 500 to 600 schools here in Maharashtra. They are not able to grow because the inability to find teachers, or these challenges keep coming up. Otherwise, we're going to create a parallel government, right? And that's where I think much more forward-thinking nonprofit should come, and which I love about what Akanksha is also trying to do, say target 5, 10, 8% of what the network of schools in a city is, and then try to influence the best practices from these schools into the remaining schools. And that's what I think. In fact, I think I'm going to take permission of Saurabh to also share that, like in Nagpur Municipal Corporation, LFE and Akanksha have come together, saying Akanksha's expertise of running high-performing schools at at a school level with teachers and everything, and then our expertise of middle management and working with the systemic level. How can both of us club together and say Akanksha is going to run 10% of the schools in Nagpur, and then LFE is going to come in and say what are some of the best practices that can be scaled. So that way, looking at a school system or a network of schools at a regional level, either a district, a block, or even a city level, is a good way forward where people can match their strength. But to broadly answer the first question, I think what are some of these beliefs that are guiding these organizations to be able to get into PPP partnership is critical to sort of write down and communicate.
If I can just stay on this issue of capacity. Now, one of the criticism against the idea of PPPs more generally, again, we're sticking to that, is that it often leads to the hollowing out of the state and the government, and sort of once these things are offloaded, they no longer sit in the ambit of responsibility of the governments. They're sort of, in any case, there is a lack of commitment, and there is a further lack of commitment that sort of results. How do you see that argument from your own experience within governments?
It is true, because I think as even what Saurabh was sharing in terms of the definition of what accountability means, right, in running these schools, saying that this is where you perform. If you don't perform, then I think we're going to pull out some funding, or you pull out some permissions for these. It doesn't exist, because the way accountability is seen within the government systems and hierarchy is very different from the way we see accountability. For us, it's the end outcome. Bacha seeka hai ki nahi is our end goal, rather than saying ki, how many, whether the kids, it's more input level, right? Like building hai ki nahi. Some of the schools also saying ki bacha, tribal schools mein the end outcome is ki bacha nahi marna chahiye 1 saal, maybe that is an end outcome. Now, when you have outcomes like that, how are we trying to push a quality agenda, right? It's not going to happen. So the way accountability, what accountability matters to government officials, to what it means to us as organizations who know that this is the end quality that's what we exist for, is very, very different. And that's where the problem comes in. So I think that alignment to say that this is what we all need to collectively fight towards, that mindset shift and the bringing together the collective understanding of the problem in itself takes a long time and takes a lot of effort. वो जब तक effort डाल देते हो तो तब तक कोई ना कोई सरकार में से shift हो जाता है, right? That's another problem. So that and this keeps sort of in a vicious cycle. So these are some of the systemic challenges that one has to also solve for. But all in all, it is still lacking. The way the accountability is defined by both the parties has to be same. Right now, there's no common understanding of the problem in itself.
With this, and you mentioned, and Madhukar also mentioned, in terms of sort of learning outcomes, and that's at least been a trend in terms of saying that, look, accountability should be the learning outcomes should be the underlying basis for holding organizations, schools, teachers accountable. And learning outcomes, like there's there's something in the Q&A also, which where the persons is rightly pointing out that these are very contextual. And if you are going to be working in a difficult area in a difficult region, the learning outcome, the benchmarks that you use, have to account for that context, which then makes it, I guess, difficult for policy to also use them, right? So there is this conundrum that on the one hand, of course, we care about learning outcomes. On the other hand, they seem to be fairly difficult to measure, to interpret, to then utilize. And given this, would it still be right for the state or government to be moving to an accountability framework which is dependent predominantly on learning outcomes, or would you suggest sort of a more nuanced, or is there a more nuanced way to incorporate learning outcomes into thinking about accountability?
So, Professor Sareen, let me just understand your question better. When you say accountability, are you referring to accountability for non-profit partners for PPP evaluation, whether it's successful, or in general, like how do you hold the system accountable to what it's sort of meant to deliver on?
So we can focus on, particularly in terms of, say, partnerships.
Right.
So right now, as you mentioned, nobody's even, the government doesn't even have an accountability framework.
Right.
And you have to set your own benchmarks and you have to sort of work towards meeting them.
Right.
I'm trying to inquire if we did move towards a system or a framework which laid down clear sort of learning outcome improvements.
Right.
The tension there is that these, the learning outcome improvements are contingent, conditional on the context, in which you're working in, or what is feasible, right? What the appropriate benchmarks should be.
Right.
So given that, how do we handle these tensions? I mean, of course, we care about learning outcomes, but from a policy level, how do we, how does this get translated is what I'm trying to ask.
Right. So I totally believe that, like whatever these tensions are can be resolved at the table. And we absolutely should sort of stay firm about the idea of assessing success of a partnership or accountability towards learning outcomes, Professor Sareen. I think for far too long, we've continued to debate the idea about, what outcomes are contextualized or not. I think there's a lot of debate and, conversations that exist. But at the end of the day, I do see that there's an alignment that outcomes are critical and that they need to sort of factor in our decision making at all levels, whether it's starting with the city municipal corporation, going to a district or state, and then, at the national level. So we totally believe that, it doesn't have to be absolute outcome attainment. It can be improvement plus a mix of absolute of where you want the children to be. It is something that is the need of the hour. And, in the current cases, Professor Sareen, where we've entered into these agreements with the government, we sat down on the table and determined, who the third party agencies will be, how will they come in and do this, what will we align on. So as long as there is an expectation setting upfront, where I'll not be shortchanged in the middle of it, where random standards are imposed on me or, something that I don't buy into. I think if that process can be done upfront on expectation setting on what are those standards on which I'll be held accountable to, then I think everyone's walking into this partnership with a fair degree of clarity and understanding and a time frame within which this success will be communicated and the agency that will do it. I think there are several of the partnerships now on development impact bonds, etc., that have also been tried as PPP model to sort of see the scaling up. And so, so that's what I would say, Professor Sareen.
So I mean, I think there would be a lot of agreement on the question of processes, sort of having processes laid out, having sort of a third party evaluation and, how that third party evaluator comes in. I guess the tensions and would also be one would be in the question of context. So for instance, Madhukar was saying the context of a tribal area might be very different from the context of a city, right? At least from the perspective of how the government might be looking at it. The other is the appropriateness, and especially when it comes to ECE, right? When you're talking about the stages of 3 to 6. Are there, standardized metrics? Should there be standardized metrics? Those are the questions that still remain. And, even in the most developed education systems, it's not like these have been resolved. So then what does one do in some ways. Yeah. Yeah, Madhukar, you want to step in and then maybe
I just wanted to, sorry, Saurabh, you were sharing something?
No, go ahead, Madhukar.
No, I was just sharing for this ECC, specifically for ECC piece, I think, and even for the schools piece here, there are certain, the thing about accountability comes in when there are standard acceptable sort of norms that are given as saying this is acceptable by the government. Like even in schools, now what is acceptable seems to be like the Shala Siddhi framework, or like you have your Niti Aayog's PGI indicators or the SECI indicators that have been developed by the Niti Aayog nationally, which more or less can be accepted. Like even with the district administration, when we talk to them, the first thing we say, okay, look, there are certain indicators that are already given in terms of learning outcomes. But I am not a heckler of saying, because I'm thinking more from a systems lens. I'm not saying the outcomes in itself cannot be an indicator for success, right? Like it needs to be a combination of a bunch of things, especially if you're an organization who's trying to work with multiple other aspects. An outcome is delivered, it's very, very dependent on that particular child at that particular moment with the conditions that are there that are affecting the child. So a lot of pieces come into play. So just purely a paper and pen test in itself shouldn't determine the success, right? But there are multiple other aspects. So there are pieces that are already defined by the government. There are certain indicators, certain frameworks that are acceptable. So I think rooting some of these conversations in those is a great thing, right? Even, I mean, some of the success for the PPP schools like an Akanksha Muktanga is just the 10th board exams. You know, that's a great indicator. It's socially acceptable. Government accepts it. Your 10th board results are great. Like, why not, right? Like, that's a great indicator. But that in itself cannot be. There are other aspects also, how you're engaging with parents, the teacher development, how you're supporting the other schools. A lot of those pieces also come into play. Now, for ECC specifically, one of the big problems was the academic framework doesn't exist, which I think was rightly pointed out in the report also. I think in a couple of months, hopefully by June 2022, the NCFSC is going to be launched, which is the National Curriculum Framework for School Education, which is a K-12 framework, which will be launched soon. And that will be mandated to centralize everything right now, because play schools operate very differently. Your Balwadis do something else, your Anganwadis do something else. But irrespective, there are a few states which are leading in this work, and Karnataka and Maharashtra are two examples of some of the strongest ECC curriculum and outcomes that are mapped both for academia and for health and nutrition also, right? And also I want to share the recent FLN mission, which is a part of national education policy. It's very clearly defined that after Balwadi, or Anganwadi, after when the child reaches the school ready, which is at the age of 6, these are the 5 or 6 skills that the child should be knowing from an academic, basic literacy and early numeracy standpoint. Those things have been defined a year back, which I think is fabulous. I think, in fact, Maharashtra adopted it. There was a government resolution also that was passed around foundation literacy and numeracy sort of mission, which is defined for every grade. So the end of kindergarten, Balwadi, Anganwadi, whatever you want to call it, at the school ready level, here are the indicators: grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, they're all defined very clearly. Now, we need to root us. That is now the government has clearly said, this is what we want for every child. We need to just pick that and run with it. The more complicated we make, saying that, oh no, but here's what we don't believe in 10, we want the child to be at a NAS, and then, but bare minimum level is, say, an USSR benchmark. Everyone knows it, and the governments have also accepted it. Then you have a NAS benchmark or a state level assessment / or NAS. I think I compare them at the both levels. If a state has their own learning achievement survey or a national achievement survey, that's a next. And then you have your international benchmarking at PISA. So even if you're able to sort of support these outcomes, which are acceptable by any person in the government who's working in education department, that's a great starting point to be able to sort of push the agenda and normalize on what we're trying to solve together.
Saurabh, you wanted to add something to that?
So nothing more to add, Professor Sareen. I think, like, having been an educator and principal myself, I do believe that we need to find a way to bring in a more laser-like focus on outcomes. It doesn't have to be SSC. It can be more holistic in nature, life skills, etc. And what Madhukar alluded to are more processes in delivering that, so that we are sort of focusing on the whole child development. I do think that that is essential. That's the only thing that I would reinforce, Professor Sareen.
So I do want to leave open some time for Q&A. But maybe if I just get to that, from both of you quickly, one area that, from your work and sort of in terms of trends that you see as an area of concern that you are finding things perhaps are going in the wrong direction, and one area that you think, yes, we sort of looks to be better. So whoever wants to go first.
Go ahead, Madhukar. So, sorry,
No.
I lost you in between as well, Professor Sareen. Pardon me.
I was just saying one area, and I mean, I'm asking you to look at trends in education or whichever area that you know, right now your mind is on, whether it be ECC or something else within education, of course. In terms of trend, one area of concern that you see, that things are going worse, getting worse. I mean, of course, the pandemic has, you know, obviously led to, you know, that impact is obviously huge, but in terms of a larger trend, and one area where you think things are getting better.
Sort of go for it. You're much more closer to the ground than I am, so you'll have better answer to this question.
So let me just take a shot at it, Professor Sareen, from both a policy as well as what we are seeing as an implementation perspective in the last couple of years. I do think that this focus on foundational literacy and numeracy as along with the early childhood education as a big push in NEP is a huge step, huge positive step. At least in the cities where we are engaging along with the state, there is a buy-in into why we need to do it at the senior most bureaucrat level, as well as for the teachers. So we are seeing that there is an intent certainly laid out, and how this is now become like a national mission where the Honorable Prime Minister sort of come and, you know, sort of laid this, you know, pretty much laid the stakes in the ground. So we are certainly seeing a huge momentum, at least in the places where we are working, at least in the mindset and the attitude and what people want to do about it. In terms of what's concerning me right now is also connected with that in our desire to sort of do this within a certain time frame, we will probably look at short-term fixes that can inflate the results fairly quickly and you know, ignore the long-term hard work that requires like systematic shifts, you know, capacity building, institutional building, something we discussed with the founder of EI, Sridhar Rajgopalan as well, that, you know, some of these things will probably take a longer time than what we have set out to do. And as long as we are aware of it, as we sort of work towards it, that how do we not get into short-term fixing this and sort of find, you know, us sort of going back. That's what is my, you know, sort of concern.
I'll start with the concerns. I think just echoing to what Saurabh has said, definitely the intent is there, but I think there needs to be greater effort of the political will and leadership that aligns to say that education itself is a big problem, and we need to put it in the top 2-3 agendas of our election manifesto. Very few sort of people are doing it. Elected representatives, I think a more and more number of people should be doing this, not just saying it, right? Like people definitely have the intent, they want to do good. No one is going to stand in an assembly and say that I don't want children to learn. Equality is not an agenda. I think whether the words are matching actions is a larger problem at you know, at hand, and I think that's something that one has to sort of figure out. I think the second piece of it is also something sort of touched upon, this the work that is required, at least from my sort of the way I'm looking at it, the problem, and from more of a systems lens, is requiring a lot of patience. I think there's a lot of push towards certain aspects. I mean, foundational level and mission is a great example. We've built in a lot of buy-in across different stakeholders, K to sort of 3 to 8 years of age. But I think doing anything in a very hurried way without giving it, I mean, I don't know who, Shubir keeps saying that it's more, you know, education is more of a gardening. It's not like manufacturing that you sort of keep doing. You need to have that patience for that, you know, to sprout and then like bloom and everything. They will take time. Just because we're doing certain things doesn't mean that the kids are actually learning. So I think like having that patience to be able to back with research, understanding the socio-political aspects of working with you know, systems will take a lot of patience, right? So many organizations are not having that patience, and that's what worries me. Let it be the pressure of money or funding or impact, whatever it might be. But where among all of this, I think someone one of our mentors, Anuaga, keeps saying working with the governments is a very spiritual experience. So we have more disappointments than actually, successes. But we draw a lot of energy from teachers, quite honestly. I think all said and done, they look at some of the areas in tribal, some of the deep rural pockets, the way the teachers have stepped up and done exceptional work. Some of the greatest innovations during COVID was not put a tech platform or do this or do that. Like simple things that the teachers have done on the ground in the States have been just, fantastic. They've been deeply inspiring, and that's what actually keeps us going. So for me, the best thing is that a lot more innovations are coming out. A lot more teachers are taking that initiative from the government systems, from some of the poorest of poor communities, some of the more tribal and deep rural pockets of India. And I think that's what is driving a lot of energy to do systems change work. Yeah.
Thanks. So we can open up the meeting to questions. There's few on the Q&A, and I think most of them have in some ways or the other been addressed. But if Saurav and Madhukar, you can also glance through it and see if there's something in particular you want to respond to. Or Pooja, Sakshi, how do you want to do this?
Sure, like we can just go through the chat box, and if there's a question which either Madhukar or Saurabh want to respond, we can go ahead with that. Some of them are general comments as well.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, there's one on with Ninad. As said, we're tying up with organizations like British Council to run English medium for under PPP. It does fall under PPP. I don't know if it is Aga Khan, British Council, or XYZ. There's no individual organizations. Everyone's doing a great job. I think the key again is just to focus on the intent. What is the end intent of running schools or whatever partnerships that one is entering into? What if the why is clear, then I think the partnership will succeed. That's what I'd like to comment.
Saurabh, anything that you want to respond to?
So I think Prasanna's question is more connected with our PPPs in general working. I don't know, maybe Professor Sareen or someone from the Vidhi panel should answer that. And I think it's a very broad frame, right? Like PPPs, there's so many different kinds of PPPs that I don't even think that anybody has sort of taken that as a magnitude, right? Like you look at a specific geography or specific context, what kind of, partnership design was it? But we had done a study in partnership with the Education Alliance 5, 6 years back on really studying the impact on learning outcomes again through the PPP models, including Muktangan and a few other nonprofits. And it certainly demonstrated, significantly superior outcomes, right? So there have been these little studies that have been done for different initiatives, but I'll let, one of you sort of respond to that if you have any thoughts about it.
I mean, you're right. I mean, this is sort of never, yes or no answer. It's always a, yes, but, and no, but, and there is always sort of a, lot of contextualization that needs to happen. And it's in large part, it has been dependent on the kind of policy framework that's laid out. I mean, what I find really beautiful in terms of the report and, what it highlights the in very detailed, in a very granular, detailed manner, the policy ambiguities. And, we talk about ease of doing business, and that sort of becomes a priority. But, ease of doing sort of social policy or ease of working with sort of, in the social sector is completely overlooked. And I don't think this is a problem just in terms of partnerships, right? I mean, this is one way as it gets evident, but there is so much ambiguity, and Madhukar, I'm sure, would be able to tell us more about it in terms of within the system itself, the communication that happens and the knowledge. We're talking about, the different partner, the private actor and the government not being aligned on objectives. I don't know how much alignment there is within the system as well. So but the problem of policy ambiguity, I think, remains sort of the most critical one when it comes to education. I don't know, Madhukar, and if you have solutions to that.
No, I mean, it all depends on the right kind of champions, quite honestly. And I don't think there are it's not like there are no examples, right? Like there are fabulous examples. Delhi is a great example. Kerala is a great example. Like you need champions who are able to drive it. Like even over the last 5-7 years, what has happened with like say Sandhya Rani, what she did in Andhra, like Anand Kumarji in Maharashtra, Rajasthan, Gangwarji was there. There were certain champions who were absolutely clear on this is what needs to happen. So that brings in a lot of alignment, saying right from a CM, minister, and a secretary of the state are speaking the same exact language. Then there's no ambiguity to say that I don't care what you do. You use technology, you want to go to homes and teach, you use this, you use constructive approach. I don't care, but a grade 3 children should be able to do these 4 functions. A grade 3 child should be able to learn these many things or read this text. It's very clear, right? Like, so someone able to communicate that and be a champion of education and say that this is going to be the reform agenda for the state for the next 5 years is something that needs to happen. And I think till the time that doesn't happen, every nonprofit, every individual, every teacher is going to say, no one, I mean, I don't know what I'm working towards, so I'm going to do what I know is best. And that can be anything. Like some NGOs, that's why I think comparing nonprofit organizations, government is very easy to say कि हमारे results अच्छे हैं, उनके अच्छे नहीं है. उनको पता ही नहीं था क्या करना है. तो इन्होंने तो PISA level पे पढ़ा दिया, वो सिर्फ अभी 10वीं पढ़ा रहे हैं. तो how is that going to even match, right? So I think like some level of consistency saying that this is what the state needs, and that's their responsibility. A child born in Maharashtra is accountable towards whoever is the minister, whoever is the school education or the women child welfare development. That's a law of land. That's why we elect the government. So I think they need to be able to communicate that vision. And I think if that is not clear, then I think it's extremely hard, because education as a people needs to be driven by people. It's a community thing. Community was not able to do it. We became so large that we elected a government and said कि आप चलाओ schools अभी. तो इस तरीके से schools work, and it's the responsibility of a community to educate the child. So I think like these kind of things need to be, you need champions to be able to drive it, and we need to cultivate those champions.
One question I just want to also, since Saurav also mentioned the Education Alliance, there's a question on saying for-profit sectors have consortiums for self-regulation. Do non-profits need to think of creating consortiums? And how challenging is it for NGOs to collaborate within themselves? Again, this is a little bit of an organization question. Saurav, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think Professor Sareen, now for most of the state or district level change efforts, in fact, the organizations have realized that the kind of depth of expertise that you require in a particular area is only available with a single organization. So people are anyway, organizations are already coming together and partnering with the government to sort of deliver on the strategic objectives. Madhukar, in fact, is a part of such an alliance, and that's where we are seeing sort of more collaborative action projects, run by nonprofits in partnership with the government for long-term system change efforts, 3 years, 5 years. In fact, Haryana, Himachal Pradesh, Rajasthan, even Maharashtra, there are so many of these examples. Uttar Pradesh right now as we speak. And there are organizations that are sort of, playing focused role on running a project management unit. There's someone bringing in capacity to develop principles, someone sort of bringing in capacity to engage with the parents. So I think this is already happening. It's not happening for regulation because we are fairly stringently regulated today. I think all the nonprofits that we've sort of collaborated with in the last 2 years during the pandemic, the CEOs and the senior leadership team members are dying out of burnout with just a number of compliance and regulatory hassles that all of us are facing. Intent may be right, but so yeah, it's not happening for that purpose. It's happening for very different reasons. So and in the spirit is fairly appropriate as well for the need of the hour.
So I'll take, I know it's 2 minutes, but this is something which is close to my heart and I want to hear just your quick thoughts on it. Does the RT, the right to education, still remain relevant given the NEP? I mean, we don't even hear, nobody even talks about the RT anymore. I'm not just talking about section 12(1)(c), but given your experiences, is that still relevant? Do you see it relevant? Either,
Madhukar, go ahead.
If you ask me, right to education in the spirit saying if every child should have the right to education, absolutely yes, it is still relevant. Every child, in fact, I would say expand the scope, saying put it from 3 to K to 12, right? Like that's what the NEP proposed. I don't know if people and the government has enough money in their coffers to be able to expand so much, but right to education in its spirit need to exist eternally. I don't think there's any question or doubt about it. In terms of the components of RT, a bunch of them I don't think stand relevant. I still think that it needs to evolve. I think there needs to be some level of amendment that needs to get in that focuses a lot more on quality, mandates a lot of quality level input indicators also. Like even inputs were there, just building schools is not going to be enough. I think what are some of those indicators? How does learning come into the way you're recruiting teachers, the way you're building schools, the way meals and their contributions, and some of the policy works. I mean, there was a recent policy that was published on the intergenerational impact on midday meal scheme of the midday meal schemes, which is fabulous. Someone did the research recently, Bangalore-based organization. Amazing it was. So I think like we need to be able to look at RT in a much more long term, which needs to shift towards like having a national level benchmark. And if FLN is for the next 5 years, great, let's root it in FLN. If not, like it needs to be something else. But I think we just need to figure out a much more holistic level of how RT needs to evolve. But RT in its essence need to exist.
All right. Saurabh, you want to add anything? Or
I would totally concur with that, Professor Sareen. I do think we absolutely need an act like that. The clauses of it have already been undergoing amendment and modification for the past few years already, like continuous comprehensive evaluation, failure, etc. So I do think we need the umbrella. I do think it brings in a level of accountability and commitment. And I think that is critical. It is crucial in the spaces that we are operating as a rights-based approach.
Great, thanks. So my gratitude to Madhukar, Saurabh, and Vidhi for Madhukar and Saurabh for sort of being great panelists. I think they've contributed a whole lot to the discussion. And thanks to Vidhi for providing us this platform and this report, which sort of engendered this conversation. So with that, I'll hand it over to Pooja, I guess. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, everyone. So, of course, this has been a very, very engaging discussion, and a lot of these points that you guys were talking about definitely came up with the study itself. And I saw there was a question on teacher innovation as well, like in the Q&A box, and Saurabh was also mentioning about it. Madhukar was also mentioning about it. So, of course, there's a lot of synergies in the things that we are talking about. PPPs in general, of course, still remain to be a highly contested topic, which is, again, like even amongst ourselves, we had different opinions, which was good to engage, and we'd like to continue this conversation. Thanks everyone who's been here to join us for the discussion. Please go through our report once. If you have any other suggestions on the report, and if you also have any further questions for the speakers, panelists, do reach out to us. We'll try our best to convey it further to the moderator as well as to speakers. Once again, thanks a lot, Professor Sareen, for moderating this entire discussion and interweaving the entire arguments very well. Thanks, Saurabh and Madhukar, for contributing to this entire discussion. Of course, my colleague Sakshi, who was here with me, and to sign language interpreters for their absolutely amazing and efficient job that they always do with us. Do keep in touch. Please feel free to write to us. I'll drop in my email ID here. Thanks once again for being a part of this discussion. Have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vidhi, Team Vidhi and Professor